Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out for this. We have some incredible people up on this stage, and we're going to talk about something that has been a hot-button issue really for as long as technology has been a consumer term, a thing that we've been wanting to buy and use. It's been in the news a lot more since the revelations of provided by Edward Snowden, but matters of privacy and digital security are now again in the news over Russian hacking and the issues of Twitter, and it's not going away. So the more we talk about it, the better. And I think a natural place to start might be asking John here, who has been involved with the web and web software for a very long time, since the 90s, and has seen these tensions between convenience and privacy and security play out. So if you could just sort of give us a brief overview of how we got here.
Well, I think in a lot of ways, a lot of things have happened in the last few years. And I think it's important to understand, for the longest time, privacy and the web was okay and they were doing well together. What's been happening in the last few years is a different story, because we have the technology to actually collect a lot of information, right? We now have the information about where everyone is at any one time as they're moving around. We have information about whatever you do on your computer. We have everything you look at. We have what you type. So there's just an awful lot of information. And I think what's been happening lately is that that information has, one, been collected more aggressively, and it's been put in use. So we're seeing the collection, we're seeing the ability to target people based on that information, and that's a new thing. And I think actually this is a serious problem, and we need to do something about that.
Yeah. Robert, the data collected in such huge quantities is of value in the law enforcement community, in the prosecution and investigation of crimes. Does that sound right to you, that this has been a boon for those in your field?
That's for you.
It's certainly central, I think, to the way in which we've responded to a more aggressive form of crime and terrorism. Of course, technology-enabled as it is. We found, a bit like the tech sector has found maybe, that where the data and the appropriate use of data can drive a different kind of response, can give us a new value, new insight into what has become essentially a transnational security threat that we face, of course. Now, we recognize also in the law enforcement community, or at least in the European Union, that we have to do that, of course, within a lawful structure and according to very important rules of proportionality, for example. And that's why at Europol we have what State Watch has described as the most robust and the best data protection legal framework of any law enforcement agency in the world. So we're proud of that, and we're proud, therefore, to use data to operate in a modern way to counter the very dangerous effects of modern security threats that we face, but in a way that I think is very transparent and proportionate in terms of the wider impact it might have on citizens' rights.
Susan, does that sound like the law enforcement community that we know in the United States?
Well, I think the word we're missing in the United States is proportional. Where John was sort of ending us up and where Robert was picking up, in the United States, of course, the moment was 9/11. And after 9/11, in the fall of 2001, we had the USA Patriot Act and all sorts of secret security surveillance programs started, many of which the public wasn't told about, many of which Congress wasn't told about. And the idea was that you need all this supersized surveillance because you have to have all this information in order to be able to connect the dots about what's happening, because you have to have all of the dots. Now, I think one of the problems was that what a lot of people said at the time was we need to give up a little bit of privacy in order to be safer. And I actually wrote a book about this because I think there's a problem on both sides of the equation. First of all, the surveillance has not been at all proportional, and as to many of the enormous data collection programs, there's really not been much proof that they have been useful to keep us safer in any way. And I think what people miss is the cost on the other side. People often say, so why should I care what the government knows about me if I'm not doing anything wrong? Well, I hope we can all come up with reasons. But one of mine is that most of us are doing things that we would prefer for the government not to be able to publicize, even if we're not being able to do anything wrong. People just have private things about whether they're pregnant, whether they're a gay teen, whatever. And if the government is watching at all times, not only does that violate your privacy, but I think it also is intimately connected with freedom of speech and association and religion, and really threatens democracy. We had the FBI for a long time was surveilling Muslim charities to try to figure out, working backwards, who was giving to Muslim charities and were they a terrorist? Well, contributions to Muslim charities went down. And we've had Penn and Amnesty and other places have been trying to do studies of the chilling effect. If people think they're being watched at all times, they're going to pull back and self-censor and not do anything they regard as controversial. Yeah. So, many costs and not so clear what the benefits are in disproportionate surveillance.
John, do you think that, how many people in this audience are on Facebook? By a show of hands. Okay, or how many of you use Google with any regularity? Okay, so same for me. I wonder what you all think about the willingness of us to forfeit our privacy in a lot of ways. That our private information isn't extracted from us, but we sign it away. It's not the government collecting it, it's Mark Zuckerberg. And I wonder how you could explain that phenomenon and whether it's sort of devalued the value or the principle of privacy altogether.
I think you're not really given a choice, are you? I mean, it's kind of like, okay, do you want to be part of the internet? Do you want to be part of the modern world? If you want to be part of that, you have to give up your privacy, which I actually think is a very unreasonable request. You're not given a real choice. You're given maybe some points, and you have to make a choice. Do you want to go ahead with this or not? And in reality, I mean, you don't have a choice. Most people don't understand the choices that they're given anyway. So it's a really uneven situation. It's kind of like going to the bank and wanting to negotiate the terms of the agreement that they put in front of you. Most of us, we just sign it. It's what you do. And this is the same here. You're having to give up your privacy to access the internet. And that's totally unreasonable. It's not needed for the services that are there. There's no reason to collect all this information, and they should not be selling our information.
So if I could follow up on that, the title of our panel is, does the convenience of new technology involve a trade-off with privacy? And I think the answer is to some extent, but not that much if we start believing in reasonable policy and regulation. So even if we can't stop collection of information, there's a lot that we could be doing to regulate who gets access to that information once it's collected, including is it passed immediately to the government, or do we have enough firewalls there? And also, what about retention? So there's a case in the United States Supreme Court this year, which is about a man who's challenging his cell phone providers turning over to the government his location information. Now, of course, knowing where you are is part of using a cell phone. They have to know which cell tower you're near, and that's part of the provision. But why do they have to keep those records? So it seems to me that we've had regulation of a number of other data collection venues in the past, and the fact that we're not getting on top of, as John says, our technology should not have to be our destiny. And the fact that you can't live without the internet doesn't mean that there can't be reasonable regulation to control what access people will have to your data.
I think my concern is that in the development of new technology, there is not enough regard given to providing adequate privacy and indeed security protections. There isn't effectively a security or privacy culture in the stage of development. Instead, there is this overwhelming commercial imperative to be the first to market, to roll it out first and patch later, or in many cases in respect of Internet of Things devices, to not patch it at all, even years later. So I think there has to be a greater degree of responsibility amongst the tech industry, especially, to deliver products that not only make a quick buck in the fastest possible way, but are also responsible in terms of the privacy and security safeguards that they provide.
It strikes me that one probably wouldn't hear what you just said coming from someone at the FBI. I think that in the States they tend to take the alternate tack, that a lack of privacy makes their job easier. Do privacy safeguard, your job on a fundamental level is keeping people safe and thwarting criminals. Do privacy safeguards represent a challenge in the conducting that job?
No, I think it's a false choice. If we're asked to choose between privacy and security, I believe that in most respects they're mutually reinforcing values. And indeed, they can both be served, of course, by the right kind of data and systems protections. And also, let's not forget that people's privacy rights are fundamental to any democracy. And the job of law enforcement, of course, is not to undermine them, but actually to protect them. But we also recognize, of course, in the online environment that there is this great dichotomy of value in technology, and that it provides these wonderful, inventive new things that are absolutely essential to us in e-commerce, such as encryption, but at the same time, fantastically abused at scale by those who wish to do us harm. And I think, therefore, we haven't yet solved that great dilemma about how to promote one and prevent the other from ruining the privacy and the freedoms that we have. And in terms of legislation, in terms of technology, in terms of better cooperation between the industry and the law enforcement, we just haven't got it right well enough yet, and I think we have to go further.
Yeah. Well, in the U.S., there's been a tremendous amount of tension between the private sector and technology and those in intelligence gathering or law enforcement positions over encryption, as you mentioned. Law enforcement, the likes of the FBI or NSA will say encryption makes it harder to catch bad guys, period. They call it going dark, and it's been a battle that's been going on for years now. Is that something that is drifted over to your side? Does Europol have a stance on that?
No, we recognize in the great majority of all the major criminal and terrorist investigations we're involved in, encryption plays a real part and presents investigators a real hurdle. There's no doubt about that. That is a fact. At the same time, we understand how important encryption is, of course, as I said earlier, in e-commerce. I think the frustration generally in law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic is that there is the great inconsistency and almost an intellectual dishonesty in the debate, because in society we seem to have successfully and rather happily legislated for the right for law enforcement to intercept a private telephone call, but we've not done that when that communication happens to take place in an online environment. So there is no policy consistency in the approach that we've taken in society. Internet is the only part of our lives in which apparently the normal rules don't apply. Now, the main reason for that is because it's much more difficult to legislate in the same way, in the same proportionate way. I understand that. But I hear from some people a different kind of argumentation which takes the internet into some kind of special place which requires special levels of privacy protections. And that's frustrating, I think, to law enforcement people.
So can I take Robert back to the United States? I think that what you're saying about in the United States, this debate is so polarized, and the way the debate about could the FBI force Apple to break into its own phone was characterized as a debate between privacy on our side and security.
Totally.
We were not going to be safe. The way I've heard the tech industry describe the battle is it's a battle between surveillance and security of our devices. Because once Apple can be forced to create malware and make its device more vulnerable, that device is going to be vulnerable to everybody.
Right.
And so I think it's unlikely that Congress is likely to prohibit encryption or to try to Bigfoot this. But I think that a lot of people don't realize that the argument on the other side is really, it's discounting another kind of security, which is the security of your device. If consumers don't have trust in their company, that their data is going to be protected, then, especially given the Internet of Things, how many people have a smart TV? Right? A smart toaster, a smart vacuum cleaner, Alexa. There's so many ways into our house now. And if all of that is stuff that the government can be gathering up, that's terrifying.
I think the way I view it, with regards to privacy, the fact that we are collecting so much information is actually a security problem. And when it comes, I'd like to make the point also, with regards to putting in backdoors. Building software that's safe is really hard. And if you want to be putting backdoors at the same time, that's a significant problem. And you know what happens when you put the key under the mat? Right. You're not only inviting your kids in, you're inviting others as well. And you just have to realize that if you're putting in backdoors, that's what you're inviting. And also think, there's a lot of things that we want to be secure. We want our transactions to be secure. You want to be able to do banking, you want to be able to do all these operations, and you want to be able to do them securely. If you're not able to do that, that's a significant problem. So I think we have to start looking at what kind of issues are we creating when we are saying that those are two different things, that privacy and security do not go hand in hand. We need the privacy for our security. The amount of information that we are collecting in BitCubs, that's a significant security problem. Just recently, we had the issue with Yahoo, right? With 3 billion accounts. Now, try to think about if all your information on all of us that Google is collecting, if that were to come out, would you like to get all your information that's on Google out to anyone? Or yourself? Would you, for you, your friends? I think it's the amount of information they're collecting is crazy. If you then go in and you look at that information, I mean, you can now do that, which is nice. You can look at your information. But you know what? That means someone else can do it as well. And it's not necessarily law enforcement. It's actually just some hacker.
So just 2 quick points,
Please.
if I may, Sam. Firstly, I also agree that backdoor encryption is a bad idea. So before anyone thinks anyone different, that's my view, and it's a view held by a number of my colleagues. Secondly, the great majority of the data breaches that we've been reading about in the press had nothing to do, actually, with encryption or some other advanced technological debate that we might be having. It's the fault of making poor decisions and having low cybersecurity standards in those companies. Very often, the data breach is the result of a very simple act of exploitation by the cybercriminal activity. So what we're dealing with most of the time is actually the need to just raise common standards to at least a minimum level. And there are some companies, even global multinationals, as we saw in the WannaCry episode, that aren't even meeting that. So let's at least get the basics right before we even begin to have these very difficult debates about how we deal with the dichotomy effects of encryption.
So here's the challenge to all of you. Are you going to figure out how to keep people's data secure, or are you going to wait for the government to make you do it their way? I think that's the question.
I think that's pretty fair. It's pretty fair. And I mean, I would imagine... John, you come from the private sector. What is the relationship like vis-a-vis regulation? I mean, is this something that companies will do on their own to protect their consumers? Do consumers have to truly demand it? I mean, I think that the idea of boycotting Facebook or Google is sort of silly. They're like you had been saying, they're unavoidable parts of using the internet to a large degree.
I mean, that's part of the problem. Yes, we can do things on our side to try to help people safe, and we do try to do so. On the other hand, those things that we do help people to keep them safe, that means they go into areas which government considers, okay, they have something to hide. And that's a bit problematic. If we were to integrate Tor into the browser or something, that makes people look suspicious. I don't think we should have to hide to use the internet. I think it's a human right to be able to use the internet without being followed all the time and our information being collected and sold. I think it's really a question of regulation and ensuring that the data that's collected is required for the service that's being performed and are not used for other purposes. That the targeting that is happening is at a level which is more about location instead of person. I think that would be a really good change. And I actually think for us to see what's been happening with regards to propaganda and the likes of the ads that have been sent out, I think we should have visibility to that. There's been some proposals on this in the United States. I would make all ads available to the public. I do not understand why our privacy is less valuable than the privacy of the advertisers. This information should be made available, and actually this is a case where big data would be really useful, because if someone has been sending out different ads to different people, we should know about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to pivot a little bit, something that you mentioned, Robert, backstage that I'll admit surprised me was that you do not support encryption backdoors, which, if anyone's unfamiliar, is the idea that you would basically, if you're Apple or Google or whatever, you build a weakness into your encryption software so that someone with the key, the government usually, can access it when needed, if they need it for a terrorism investigation. This was a big deal after the San Bernardino shootings in the States. But you oppose such measures, and I think a lot of people assume that anyone in the law enforcement or intelligence community would be for them. So I was really fascinated by that.
Well, of course, within the common understanding of what backdoor encryption means, I certainly do oppose it, because I think it would, the logic breaks down in that we would be deliberately engineering a vulnerability in our systems, of course. That said, I do wish for a much closer relationship between law enforcement and the tech sector, in a ways that, since broken down following Snowden, of course. Because I do think that under the right kind of lawful supervision, law enforcement authorities should have the power to decrypt certain certain devices that are held by legitimate targets, of course. And to do that, they need to develop their capability. And I think there is an area of cooperation which is not at all about giving a key to a particular device, but developing the general capability of law enforcement to do its work of investigation in an online environment. And I regret the fact that we don't have the kind of relationship between those two industries that we once had following 9/11, for example. And that's certainly been one unintended consequence of the Snowden revelations.
Susan, we were running out of time here, but I would love a response to that wish for a closer relationship between law enforcement and the private sector.
Law enforcement, the private sector. Well, it's very interesting because right after 9/11, all the private sector, the tech companies, the telecoms, couldn't hand over their customers' private information to the United States government fast enough. But I think especially after Edward Snowden, I think the companies realized that their consumers do care about privacy. Plus, it turns out privacy is good for business, because if the American internet is not secure, the internets will grow up in other places of the world that will meet the customer's demand for security. Right. So, I think we have a very strong partnership right now. At first, Microsoft and Google and all were kind of on the other side.
Right.
But recently, they've been very strong allies of the ACLU in our work against supersized surveillance, looking for more transparency in the government.
Right.
Apple wants to be able to tell its customers how many times the FBI has come to them for customer information.
Right.
So the tech companies have been enormously important in terms of the pushback.
John, final words.
So I think sometimes, and I saw the discussions in the US on kind of the company should be working with the government and the like. Now, which government? So if we should do that for the US government and the British government and the EU government, what about other governments? Should we be doing the same thing with Iran, North Korea? Yeah. I mean, tech companies are global. So if you're opening back doors for your country, they would expect you to do the same for others. And I think you have to think about, we're in a global world, and the communication that's happening on those issues is not local, it's actually global. I think
that's a great important point, and I would love to talk about this for another hour, but unfortunately we are out of time. So let me give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.
And thank you, all of you, for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good rest of your week.
So we ended 13 seconds early.